So when it does come the right time, that they know where they can go. And so on your podcast, there's two types of calls to action that we always recommend you have. And we talked about this in the content outlining section. So you've seen this before, and I just want to make sure you see where it fits here. I mean, that's the soft call to action, the hard call to action. So the soft call to action is your on-platform action that you want your listeners to take, right? And that's the, hey, if you liked this episode, click the like button and the subscribe button, hit that notification bell, right? Whatever it is, the on-platform action. And so you want to make sure you have that in every single piece of content that you put out, is have that soft call to action that says, hey, if you liked this, hit the subscribe button, right? Because if they subscribe to it, they'll get more notifications. It'll show up in your feed more. And that's your goal, right? You want to show up in their feed all the time. You want to create that omnipresent. And so the more people that'll take that soft call to action, the better. Welcome to PBP.FM, brought to you by Push Button Podcasts, your go-to resource for grabbing attention, building awareness, and creating authority in your marketplace. I'm Richard Matthews, your host and guide through the wonderful world of podcasting as a driver of business. Here, we teach how to use a multimedia podcast as the cornerstone of your omnipresent content marketing strategy. Whether you're an entrepreneur, podcaster, expert, or thought leader, you'll discover creative ways to leverage your digital content. From blogs to video, from YouTube to TikTok, and everything in between. We'll show you how to stand out from the noise so you can directly connect with potential customers, build strategic partnerships, and drive leads into your business. Get ready for actionable tips and tangible takeaways on improving your digital presence across the board. With that, let's dive into this week's episode of PBP.FM. Hello and welcome back to the PBP.FM podcast. I'm Richard Matthews, CEO of Push Button Podcast, and I've got my recording buddy here, Kevin Rundle. Kevin, are you there?
I am here, Richard.
Awesome. Glad to have you here. I know last time we talked a little bit about project management and managing your post-production of your podcast. Today, we're going to move back into our 10 Commandments of Podcasting series that we've been working through and talk about thou shalt drive to an action. And it's one of the rules of your podcast. If you are running a podcast for your business, one of the things that you want to do is you want to drive people to an action. Otherwise, what's the purpose of doing this? Are we just entertaining people, or are we actually trying to drive results in our business? So that's our discussion for today. What are your initial thoughts before we dive into this?
I mean, because I've been in marketing so long, driving to an action feels like a natural way to talk about this. From a business perspective, I can't, right? If it costs you more to do it than not to do it, not doing it sounds like the right choice. So those are my initial thoughts. But
so for me, the drive to an action is a really important aspect of what we're building, right? Because if you're building a podcast, the purpose of building a podcast is going to come down to, and I know we've talked about this in previous episodes, the type of podcast you're building, right? So we talk about two different types of podcast. One is the media podcast, and the other one is the strategic influence podcast. Right? And so just a quick refresher, the media podcast is the podcast where the podcast itself is the business, right? And so when the podcast is the business, these are your big podcast names, Joe Rogan, the Daily Wire, stuff like that, where the podcast is the business and the business model is get eyeballs and with those eyeballs, put advertising in front of them or sell gated content of some sort, right? And that's the model. And so that advertising pays the bills for all of this stuff. And then the podcast itself is a business. So you got very different KPIs and very different calls to action that you'll be using on those kind of things. Your calls to action are going to be like, hey, we're sponsoring Surfshark today, right? And, go check out them, use our coupon code, right? Those kind of calls to action. What we're looking at in the Strategic Influence podcast, which is what we're teaching people how to build, is the Strategic Influence podcast is to help you build attention, awareness, authority in your marketplace to drive sales into your business, drive leads and sales for whatever it is that your products and services are in the marketplace. And so if you have products and services in the marketplace, that's why you'd be running a Strategic Influence podcast. If you don't ever actually tell people about them, what's the point of what you're doing? So that is what we're going to talk about today, is several different ways that you can use calls to action in your podcasts, and both inside the podcast and outside of the podcast, how you can leverage what we're doing to create revenue.
Perfect.
Cool. So if the purpose is to drive revenue, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the different ways you can drive revenue with your podcast. So there's three different ways. First way we already talked about, ads, right? And so ads are going to be primarily for the media style podcast. And ads, if you're going to do ads, there's two types of ads that you can run on your podcast. You can run the ads where you have a sponsor come in and they pay for your audience. This doesn't really start to make sense until you have thousands upon thousands of subscribers, because ads are sold on what they call CPM, or cost per milla. And milla is the number per thousand people. And so those prices range anywhere from like $25 to $500 to maybe $1,000 cost per 1,000 people that you have. So if you don't have 1,000 people listening to your podcast regularly, you can't really sell ads yet. So that's where the third-party ads are not generally going to be something we're going to talk a lot about, because most of our businesses aren't looking to build thousands upon thousands of followers. They're looking to get their name known in their either the local community or in their specific niche. And so we're going to talk about a different type of ad, which is generally a self-sponsored ad, right? And so the self-sponsored ad is, just as an example, you have your podcast going. Halfway through the podcast, you're a real estate agent and you're talking about, maybe you're talking with one of the local restaurant owners about, their restaurant in the community and whatever's going on in there. Halfway through the show, you might have a short little 20, 30-second thing. They're like, hey, this podcast is brought to you by our real estate company, right? So if you or someone in the community is looking to move into this community, reach out to us here, right? That's the end of your commercial. So it's a self-sponsored style ad that might be either at the beginning of the podcast, the middle of the podcast, or the end of the podcast. And the only purpose is to just let people know, regardless of whatever the content is that you're talking about today, that, hey, we actually have an offer in the marketplace. And so you'll probably see, if you're watching this podcast, we have those, right? We have an intro, we have an outro, and there may be an interstitial. That's what the middle commercial is called, where we'll mention like, hey, if you are interested in getting a podcast started, check out our, come and get a demo or something like that, or a free podcast strategy session call with us over at Push Button Podcast, right? It's a real simple commercial that just lets people know when they're engaging with your educational content that there is more that they can do, that you actually have an offer in the marketplace. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So that's the first one.
So when you're talking to strategic, oh yeah,
go ahead.
I'll let you go. Actually, I'm going to wait till the end because this is going to be a more overarching question. Anyways.
So the second one is direct sales. And so direct sales is something that not a lot of people actually recognize they can do with their podcast, right? So like right now, Kevin and I are talking. Kevin's my guest. And so Kevin is not a potential sale for me, but one of the things that we can do is you can invite people onto your show that might be good clients. And this is something that like we do regularly on our Hero Show podcast, right? That's the other podcast that I run. And we use, I don't know if you ever heard of Chet Holmes and his Dream 100 book. And talks about like, hey, here, if you put down the 100 clients you wanted to work with, and there's a whole thing on that. But say you have your Dream 100 clients, you can start inviting them onto your podcast. And you can use the podcast as a way to build a relationship with them and to find out how you can use your podcast as a direct acquisition of sales. And we'll talk a little bit about how you do that, but that's the second method, right? You can invite people that you want to be your clients onto your podcast. And there's some specific things that you can do to make that not feel like you're being gross and salesy, but how to make that actually be cool and mutually beneficial for the both of you. We'll talk about how to do that when we get to the how section of this episode. And then the third one is networking, right? And so there's the direct acquisition of high value clients. And then the networking side is, I call it, and referral partners and things like that, where you're like, I want to invite this person on so I can get in front of their audience in some way. And so we'll do that. And we use our podcast to build relationships with people, generally speaking, who either have a stage that we can speak on, or have a podcast that we can speak on, or their audience of clients is our audience of clients. And we want to be able to build a referral relationship with them. So we'll use the podcast as a way to start that relationship and to build a strategic partnership with them that actually turns into sales down the road. So those are the three different ways that you can drive revenue with your podcast. Ads to your services, that takes time. And then the direct acquisition of clients and networking partners, both of those can happen very quickly. So that's the top level like thought processes there.
So when you're talking about those three within the strategic, what are the KPIs? Because like most people are pretty clear what the KPIs are when it comes to an advertisement. So direct sales, the KPI is obviously clear. When I say these words, how many clicks do I see move across the screen? How many sales do I see? What's the ratios?
Yeah.
For the other two, what kind of KPIs are you looking for?
So with the networking and your direct acquisition of high value clients, I'm generally looking at like a 25%, right? So if I invite 4 people on that are like, I think these people would be good clients, if I can turn 25% of those into a sales call, I'm happy about that, right? And what I have found is that I'm generally better than that, but that's my target, is about 25% into sales calls. And then your sales close ratio goes from there. And the reason for that is a lot of times you don't actually know before you get on the phone with them if they have the problem that you solve, and like where that, because you're guessing, right? It's a guessing game. You're like, hey, this person looks like they would be a good client based on what you can see on the outside. And then you invite them in and you find out, is that true or not? yes or no. And then when it's a yes, then it's like, okay, they would potentially be a good client, and you can turn those into sales calls. So that's my sort of gut benchmark is about 25% of the people when I'm specifically targeting, and that's for either one of those, either strategic partnerships or the direct sales. As I'm looking to, if I invite 4 people on, I'm going to get 4 great episodes for my podcast either way. So it's one of those win things. I'm going to get good stuff. We're going to build that relationship up, and we've built the networking. And then a lot of times, 100% of those relationships will turn into something like, hey, when in the future, if they run into someone, they might just, either refer them to our podcast or refer them to our services, those kind of things. So they turn into positive relationships regardless. But as far as like this turns into an actual like partnership, an official partnership or an official sale, my goal is 25% of the people I invite on turn into those. And that's my gut benchmark for those.
I've been focusing January topics. I've been focusing on the goals I set and the way I reflect on them. And in the last 3 years, especially, but in the last year, moreover than any other, I've moved away from saying I want to sell 25% of pitches and I want to say I want to make 10 pitches because I'm in control of making 10 pitches. I'm not in control of 25% of people buying, if that makes sense. And so I've been trying to refactor my KPIs in such a way that I can say, I want to show this to 2,000 people because I'm in control of showing it to 2,000 people, as opposed to saying, I want to convert 100 people. And then we have to work backwards to like, okay, if I show it to 2,000 people, how many people convert? If that's 100, sweet. If that's 15, sweet, whatever. I can work on tweaking those things, but I want to make sure that everything is within an action bound big goal that I'm in control of. Because for a long time, I set these goals that were not really in my control. And as much as like the work is in your control, when you know if it's going to be 10 calls or 100 calls to make 5 sales, like to make 2 sales, I found that it was much easier to stick with the I can make 100 calls and that being the goal, make 100 calls as opposed to make 2 sales.
Yeah, that's a
That
really
makes
good
sense.
point. And so to that end, I do the same thing. So
Yeah.
my recommendation is for all of our clients is that your show is going to be weekly, right? So you're going to do at least 4 calls every month, right? 4 recorded episodes per month. And, some months it's going to be 5, right? Because, I think March has like 5 weeks in it or something like that. A few of the months have
Right.
5.
Yeah.
So it's either 4 or 5. And so what we generally recommend is on the action side, because that's where you can actually set your intention on like, hey, this is what I want to make sure happens, is either 25 or 50% of your episodes are interview episodes, and the other 25 or other 50%, 75% of them are you and someone on your team, like what you and I are doing talking. I mean,
Right.
we're not doing a great job out here on the PBFM podcast because we're doing all us. Right? But when
Right.
you're
Yeah, I
using
mean,
it,
we could change that in the future if that's what it looks like, right?
yeah. But right now we're doing all us. But our recommendation for our clients and people who are looking to drive revenue with their podcast is to have that every other episode just about is a guest interview. And so that means, if you're doing 2 interviews a month with someone else, that you're doing one of them is a potential direct high value client, and the other one is a strategic partner, right? That you could potentially meet with. It doesn't have to be, some months it could be both clients and both strategic partners, but right, that gives you a goal, an action goal every
Yeah.
month that you're just like, hey, if I'm meeting with one strategic partner every month, at the end of the year, if you've met with 12 potential strategic partners and 3 or 4 of them actually turned into like a good call and a referral, that can be big, right? So for us, this last year, I probably met with 4 or 5 different strategic partners, or maybe even more than that, maybe 6. We ended up with 3 of them saying yes and start turning into like an official relationship. One of them was at the beginning of the year, and that one strategic partnership was worth half of our revenue for the whole year, right? And so it's the kind of thing that can be, all right, and that was over $250,000 in revenue. So it's the kind of thing that, depending on your business and depending on what your price points are for your services and those kind of things, one good strategic partner is worth its weight in gold. And so if you're meeting with one strategic partner or potential strategic partner every month on your podcast, just like clockwork, that can be a huge revenue driver in your business. And the same kind of thing with your high value clients. Your high value clients are the ones that either they've got a high dollar amount that they'll drive a lot of revenue, or they'll just be great clients because they'll turn into good referral sources, or there's lots of different ways you can look at what's a high value client look like in your business. But again,
Yeah. So the high value client is a potential strategic partner almost every time, anyways.
yeah. And so a high value client, when you close a high value client, it turns into more revenue generally than what their initial service fee is or whatever. And so if you have a
Yeah.
system in place, and you can basically, what we're talking about is using your podcast to make that a systematic part of your business, that you are regularly driving high value clients and strategic partnerships into your business to start creating a different type of lead flow. Right. And so I know we've talked about this before, and we'll talk about it. We're going to do a whole episode on this, but we talk about, you have an offer in the marketplace. And if you're going to get your offer in the marketplace, there's 4 different ways you can put your offer in front of the marketplace: buy, borrow, build, blitz, right? You can buy audience, you can borrow audience, you can build your own audience, or you can blitz. That's like cold outreach audience. And so your podcast is all about building your own audience, which takes time. And what we're talking about
Right.
here is that while you're putting in the time and effort to build your own audience, to put your offers in front of people, you can also be using that time strategically to help borrow other audiences. And we're using the podcast to hit 2 different categories here and drive leads multiple ways. Hopefully that makes sense.
All right. So, yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. So then the follow-up question is, what are the actions you've already sold them? They want a strategic podcast. They see it's there. What are the things they actually have to do or pay somebody to do to make that work?
Yeah. So you have a podcast like this one, right? Where we're actually, we're creating and educating on a regular basis. So I want to talk about we're going to talk about 2 different calls to action, right? So we're going to talk about how you do the calls
Right.
to action with your networking, right? So if you're going to do high value clients or high value strategic partners, so we'll talk about that first. And then the second one, we're going to talk about the actual driving of leads, which is your calls to action in your actual podcast. So on the first side,
Perfect.
which is your question, how do you actually turn your podcast into a lead source with the networking that you do? So the first, of course, you have to have who you want to talk to, right? That's where you're going to put together your list of potential clients or put together your list of potential partnerships. And so let's assume you have those things. You invite someone onto your podcast. Here's what I generally do. So the invitation is the first part of that process. Because if you invite people on and you say, hey, I want to invite you onto my podcast so I can sell you my services, you're dead in the water, right? That's not what we're looking to do. So what you're looking to do is ultimately you want to create value for your audience, and you want to create value for the person that you're bringing on, right? And so as long as you're always approaching it from
Right.
that value perspective, it's like, hey, we have a podcast called The Hero Show, and we'd like to invite you onto The Hero Show so that we can tell your story. Here's what the purpose of The Hero Show is, right? The purpose of The Hero Show is that we tell the stories of entrepreneurs as if they're comic book superheroes. And the reason we do that is because we think the narrative around entrepreneurs constantly being vilified in media and online is not a complete narrative, right? It doesn't actually help entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs, help change the world. And so we're working to change that narrative, and we'd like you to be a part of that. And so you get to help contribute to the value of that for being one of our guests. And when you are one of our guests, we'll talk about your business and we'll talk about who you are and what you do in the marketplace, right? And so we have a value proposition for the podcast. Similarly, if we were talking about this show, the Push Button Podcast thing, and I was going to invite a guest on here, we might be looking for, as an example, if we were looking for dream clients, we might be looking for someone who's got a podcast already and they have an audience of people. And we want to talk about how their podcast has been helping them grow their business. And we might be interested in having them so we can take over their post-production, right? They might be a dream client. So our offer to them might be like, hey, come on the Push Button Podcast show. And we want to talk about with you how podcasting has grown your business, right? So we can talk about that. And then, so we're talking about the intersection of their business and ours, right? And that's generally what you're doing is you're going to be talking about some intersection between how does what you do in the marketplace and what we do in the marketplace, what do they call those? Venn diagram. What's the Venn diagram of our life and our business?
Yeah. How do they overlap?
Yeah, how do they
Where's the
overlap?
synergistic point?
Yeah, what's the synergistic stuff? And so when you approach it that way, it's like, hey, we want to talk about the synergy between what you do and what we do in the marketplace. That'll create a good, valuable conversation for our audience. And we will be putting you in front of our audience, right? Even if our audience is small or whatever, it doesn't really matter. The idea is that the podcast itself and the discussion we have will be valuable to you. It'll be valuable to me. It'll be valuable to our audience. So that's the first thing. As long as what you're approaching and what you're asking for is we're going to create a valuable piece of content to put into the marketplace, that's your first win, right? That's the first thing that you're looking for. And
Yeah.
so when you're inviting people, have that mindset in place, right? Again, that's completely antithesis to, I want you to come on my podcast so I can pitch you, right? That's not what we're looking to do. And so the second step, when you get the yes, I'd like to come onto your podcast, is I always book 15 minutes before and 15 minutes after the podcast interview. So I book 90-minute slots, generally speaking, because I generally do about an hour podcast. If you do half an hour podcast, you might book, 50 or 60 minutes for your time slot. What your goal is, you want to have some time to talk to them before the interview and some time to talk to them after the interview, right? And so the before interview part is where all the magic happens. I say all the magic. Half the magic happens there. The other half happens at the other end. So your pre-interview conversation is where you get permission to soft pitch them. And so here's what that looks like. Because again, our goal is not to just pitch them on your offer, because now you feel gross and yucky and they feel gross and yucky. So we want to avoid that. So
Right.
what we're doing is I've have you on the podcast, have you on my show. It's like, hey, Kevin, great to have you here. I want to just, before we get into the interview, let's take a few minutes and talk about what we're going to do on the show and just get to know each other so we have good context for the conversation. So can we start off? Let me ask you a few questions about your business, just so I understand you and I can make this really valuable for you. And so I might ask things like, what do you do in the marketplace? What's your offer? How can we make sure that we are framing the offer well for our audience? Right? What are some of the things that you're looking to accomplish in your business this year? Those kind of things. That just gives me a good idea of who they are, what they're looking for, and we can just sort of make sure that as we're going through the interview that I'm bringing up their offer and talking about their stuff. So we're actually making it valuable to them and still making it valuable to the audience, right? And so we're building that reciprocity and we're making sure we understand who they are and what their offer is. Does that all make sense?
100% makes sense.
Yeah.
100%.
So then the second part of that, and this is where the magic is, and I have a friend of mine who helped me develop this, and we call it the magic question. And the magic question is basically getting permission to soft pitch them. And so be like, awesome, I have a really good understanding of who you are and what you're doing in the marketplace, Kevin. Would you mind if I told you a little bit about what we do with our company so you understand the context that I'm coming to the conversation from? 100% of the time, the other person will say yes. Yes, please tell me what it is that you do, because what you're doing essentially is you're giving them the same benefit that you just got, right? I understand who you are and what you're doing in the marketplace. So now we can have a smarter conversation, right, on our podcast. And so what I do then is I have a short version of my pitch that is not actually, it has no close in it, no like, hard close or soft close or any of the sales
Yeah,
close.
it's the before the doors open part of the elevator pitch.
Yeah, where the doors open, it's like, here's what we do in the marketplace. And so for a push button podcast, when I have someone on the Hero Show, I'll be like, okay, awesome, Kevin, here's what we do, right? I'm the CEO of Push Button Podcasts, and this is the offer we have in the marketplace. We help people with their podcast post-production. We do A, B, C, and D. And we do it at a high level, white glove. Do you have any questions on that? Yes or no, right? That kind of thing. And what you've done essentially is you've soft pitched them. Now they know what you do. And so you're taking this podcast that's value to them. So you're creating the reciprocity, you're giving them your offer, and then you're going to get on a podcast interview and you're going to talk for the next 20 minutes, 35 minutes, 45 minutes, or sometimes like we have like hour and a half long podcasts occasionally where we really get to dive into and know their story and get to know them and talk back and forth and get to see who they are. And they get to see who I am, and we get to exchange stories with one another. And so that's that first part, is you can get that soft pitch in at the beginning. And so that's part of the whole process. And so that's before the interview. And so if that makes sense, we can stop there for a second, because I'm going to talk about how you handle the interview in just a minute, because that's important. But do you have any questions on how you handle the
Yeah,
pre-interview?
makes good sense. And I've watched the interviews, so knowing that's the way you lead into it. I mean, I haven't watched all of them, but I've watched about 50,
Yeah,
which I think is pretty good. I might be one of your best viewers.
probably. We've got like 250 episodes now. I don't think they're all published yet, but we have.
I know you got a lot of. I was gonna watch them all, and then I started just picking the ones I was interested in.
Yeah, when they got something that's that big.
Because I'm a human, and there's a lot of content there,
Yeah.
right?
And
Literally, if you didn't sleep, you'd have 10 days worth minimum.
at least. So that's the first part, is you want to frame the first part of the interview, before the interview, as a way to be able to both find out who they are, find out what the value is, give them a soft pitch, and then you move into the actual interview portion. And so if that makes sense, I'll talk about how we handle the interviews.
Yeah, let's do it.
The interview portion it's hard to describe how to do this, because we're going to do a whole podcast on how to give good interviews. So I'm going to give you just like the highlights here. But learning to give good interview is about being ignorant and curious. So even if you're an expert in the topic, right? So if I was going to go on someone else's podcast and talk about podcasting with them, or whatever, I'm going to pretend to be ignorant and just be curious about who they are and what they do. And I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to dive in and be like, oh, that's really interesting. Tell me more about that. So ignorant and curious, because your goal is, we want this interview to be valuable to the person who's listening to it, right? And so that's the first part, ignorant and curious. And then the second part is the mutual exchange of stories. And this is a really interesting thing to understand. So human beings judge the depth of our relationships based on how much of the other person's story that we know. And so here's the proof of that. If you know someone's name, but you don't know any of their story, we call that person an acquaintance. If you don't know their name or any of their story, we call them a stranger, right? If you know their name and you know some of their stories, you might call them a friend. And if you know their name and you know so much of their stories that every time you hear them tell a story, you can tell the differences between this time they told the story and last time they told the story, you might call that person a best friend, right? And so we define our relationships based on how much of the other person's stories that we know, right? And the people that you know the best, right? Like perhaps your wife or your best friend for your whole life. The only way that you actually deepen your relationship with them is to go out and create new stories together or go have new experiences that you can share with each other, right? And so that's how we judge the depth of our relationships is on how much of the other person's story we know. Does that make sense?
That's a super interesting perspective. I never thought of it that way. You just gave me two nuggets. The ignorant and curious. I think it's funny that you use those words because I'm thinking about some cold marketing I've been, I don't know if it's marketing, but some cold outreach I've been doing recently because it's not really with a call to action. And those are the two frames for the outreach is like, hey, I'm new and I don't know very much about this. Would you be willing to give me some time and tell me what the perfect this is to your company?
Yeah.
I have nothing to sell. And I've actually had a remarkable response rate, like 75% plus on cold outreach
Yeah.
have got back to me, which is like insanely good. And it's all been because I've been like, hey, student here, don't have anything for you. Could you answer a question within your industry that I can't seem to figure out on my own?
Yeah. So the
So, and
ignorant
then the
curious.
second one, the idea that relationship or the way we think of other people is based on how many of their stories you know. I think that's a brilliant perspective. I've never heard anybody say it that way. There's probably some source that you came to for that, or maybe that's
That is
a Richard original, but
that one,
amazing.
as far as I know, is a Richard original. I've been talking about that for years. It's my if you go on my LinkedIn profile, my about section, I've got a whole story about that. But the reason why
Well, don't worry, I've stolen it.
you've
It's
stolen it,
mine
you can
now.
use it. Anyone can use it. I think it's a really good way to think about how, like anything in business or in life or in your relationships at home or with your family and kids, it's all about the other person's story that you know. So if you know that, you can hack relationships, right? And so the podcast is
Yeah,
relationship hacking on steroids, right? And it's because you're leading with
right.
value. We're going to do something that's going to put you in front of other people. We're going to tell your story. Everyone loves to talk about themselves and tell their stories. And so you're leading with value, which is great. And then in the podcast, we're going to share stories with one another. And so when I ask someone a question on the podcast interview, whatever those questions are, right, whatever your outline is, this is why it's difficult to like teach people how to do this because you have to have like your own process and whatever you want to talk about on your show, right? The Hero Show, we go through a very specific set of questions and we get people to tell their stories. On this podcast, we're doing a lot more education, but we're still sharing stories and examples back and forth as we go. It's like, hey, here's what I'm working on. Here's what we're working on. We're hearing us share these stories back and forth. And occasionally we pull in our family and stuff like that. But the idea is anytime that you ask your guest to share a story or they do share a story in response to a question that you've asked, your goal then is not to just listen to that story and be great, that was a good story. Your goal is the mutual exchange of stories. So when you listen to someone and they tell you a story, right? So like, we'll just use a fun example that you've seen both of us, we both have toddlers running through the house. And when one of our interviews, I'm sure you may have gotten edited out, but like one of your naked toddlers like ran through the background, right? And so we talk a little bit about
Right.
that. And then my response then is I'm looking for in my life, where do I have stories that are similar? And so I was like, hey, I actually had that happen to me as well. Like I had my 2-year-old, run butt ass naked through the back end of my thing. And now we've mutually shared a story back and forth. And that's what you're looking for. You're looking for as
Yeah.
many opportunities as you
It's a
can.
shared experience. We both blushed.
Yeah. You're looking for as many opportunities as you can through that podcast interview for them to share a story and then you to look through your bank of stories that you have and share one back with them. Right. And
Yeah.
so this is where it's really important. So you will probably feel weird sharing the same story with multiple guests over and over again because you're thinking to yourself, my audience has heard this story already. And here's where I'm going to tell you it does not matter. Because when your audience is listening to you, remember our goal with the audience is we want our audience to know, like, and trust us. And so if they hear us tell the same story 10, 15 times, now they know our story. And this is how you build that fame with people, right? So when people have,
Yeah.
internet fame, it's because your audience knows so much of your story and you don't know any of theirs, right? And so it's okay to share the same stories over and over again. And I also look at that as practice, right? We talked about this, I believe, when we talked about listening to comedians and practicing your stories. And so, practicing your stories, you can practice your stories over and over again with your different guests. And so, you end up having a bank of really good stories that you have refined over the course of time, which makes you a better communicator. So, it's
Right.
okay to share the same story with multiple guests. And so, what you're looking at is how can I
Yeah.
hear their stories and share my stories in exchange with them? And there's always benefits to that. So, does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I think The caveat I'd give to that, and I'm just saying this because it happened to me recently. I don't mind hearing the same story from somebody kind of on loop. What I find is that you can give yourself a serious authenticity kick. And one of the major creators that I follow a lot tells the same stories quite frequently. But one of the problems I have with his retellings is sometimes he'll frame them different, or he'll do lead up, or the details of the story will change significantly enough that it's jarring because I already know the story. So be careful to make sure the stories you tell, you try to keep consistent.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a good point. You
and
wanna
I'm
be
not going to
authentic.
say
You
any
wanna
names
make
because it
authentic
doesn't
yes.
matter, but like lots and lots of creators have heard their stories several times, especially interview style creators. But I do find like when this time it was this kind of struggle and last time it wasn't, that is where it was different enough that it feels like you're telling the same story, but you've edited it for some reason that doesn't feel authentic anymore. Like people are, as much as you don't want to hear the same story, people do actually remember the stories you tell them often.
Yeah, so stories are how we relate to each other. So if you're going to change the story, generally what I'm talking about is like, which emotion are you gonna emphasize
Right.
this time? Or which detail makes the most sense, right? Because 'Cause you're looking for in this story,
Right. 100%.
how do we connect with the story that you just told, right? And so if it might be the story that you just told was about this thing that was, it was embarrassing to me, right? So I have a story, right? Another story that's similar. I might emphasize the embarrassment of the story. Where if when I share it again another time with someone else, it might be a different part of the thing that I might emphasize, a different part of the story. And so you end up with whatever the story might be a little slightly different. But the idea, what I want people to take away from this is what your goal is. Your goal is to have as many opportunities during the course of your interview to have that mutual exchange of stories. Because if someone
100.
knows now, at the end of the interview, when you get to the end of the interview, someone knows who you are. They know what your offer in the marketplace is. You have given them a really good interview that's going to be valuable to them in their business, and it's going to be valuable to your audience. You've created value together, right? So there's a lot of like benefits that are building up here. And you've spent the last, however long together sharing stories with each other. So you feel connected. You've built that relationship together. And so they know you, like you, trust you, they enjoyed their time with you, right? They had a good time. They've got the good feelings together. We're like, I enjoyed spending 45 minutes with Richard, right? I enjoyed spending 45 minutes with Kevin. I know a bit about who he is, what he does, how he approaches the marketplace, and those kind of things. And so what's interesting is like, I'm always looking for both life stories and then also business stories to share with my guests. And the business stories are strategic in a sense that I'm like, when I'm sharing a story about like either a staff member or another client or a customer service issue, I'm looking at how do I not just get the story across to our audience or to the person we're talking about, but also they're getting to see a little bit about how I think about business and how I think about my clients and how I think about my staff and how I think about running our company.
Right.
Because you're getting the opportunity to share your values as opposed to just your offer, right? And so you get through the course of the interview, they know your offer, they know your stories, and they know a little bit about of your values as well. And so that interview portion can turn into a really, like I said, it's relationship hacking, right? You have shortened the amount of time it takes to go from we're strangers to we're friends, right? And we might do business together.
Yeah.
Are you ready to amplify your influence and stand out from the noise? Join Richard Matthews on pbp.fm as he explores the power of podcasting, social media, and strategic content to boost your reach. You'll discover the latest trends in video, audio, and influencer marketing, plus unlock insider tips to create binge-worthy content spotlighting you as a leader. With upbeat energy and clear, empowering advice, Richard guides publishers, experts, and entrepreneurs on starting a podcast, improving social strategy, and connecting with your perfect audience. Visit pbp.fm and book a podcast strategy session to start spreading your message today.
So that's the interview section. And then you have the post-interview section. And so the post-interview is where you can turn it into actual business. And again, this is going to be the same kind of things, whether or not it's a direct client or a strategic partner. But what you're looking at the end of the interview is you've hit the stop record button and you got a few minutes to debrief, right? So if you're using recording software like Squadcast, right, which we're on right now, there's that couple of minutes of time where it's like, hey, you have to leave the browser window open anyways to make sure our files upload, right? And so I'll generally do things like that. We'll take the couple of minutes after the interview and Let them know like, hey, can you just keep the browser window open while our files upload? And I have a couple of things I just want to go over with you. First off, thank you for coming on the podcast today. I just want to know what our post-production schedule looks like. We're 2 or 3 weeks ahead on post-production. This is when the interview is going to come out. Here's what our team creates for them. Which of these assets might you like us to send you so that you can use them and promote your own business however you like, those kind of things. So it's just a sort of a value thing, like, hey, let me show you what it's going to look like. And then the next thing is the second part of like the magic questions. And the magic questions here are, how do I provide value to this person that was just on my podcast interview? So if I'm talking to a potential strategic partner, that looks different than perhaps if I'm talking to a strategic or to a high value client. So I'll talk about those two separately. So when you're talking to a strategic partner, my goal is I want to get in front of their audience, right? So that's my goal. And so again, it starts with the value first proposition. It's like, hey, over the course of the interview, I heard that you do X, Y, Z, right? Or I understand that you do these things. I understand that you have I'll just use one of the examples. One of our strategic partners now, they do 4 times a year, they do stage events with a bunch of attorneys, right? And they teach marketing to attorneys. And so my question to him when we got off of the interview was, I understand that you have stages where you teach to attorneys. Do you think your attorneys have any interest in learning about how a podcast can drive revenue for their business? I have this talk and this talk already prepared. I'd be happy to send them to you to see if that might be a good value, like a value add to your audience, right? And so what I've discovered is like, you're looking for having resources already put together that you can share with someone and be like, hey, this would be valuable for your audience. Can I give this to your audience in some way? And if someone has an audience, one of the things they're always looking for is, how do I provide more value? Right? How do I provide more value to my audience and make their lives better? And so that's what you're looking for, is you're looking for, where are the things that I have that I can give value to their audience and just be useful to them. And so how that particular relationship ended up going is, he was like, yeah, that's really interesting. I actually have a smaller subset, right? I have a smaller mastermind group. And before I invite you onto this stage, the big stage, I'd like you to come and teach a small class to this group of like 10 attorneys that are like our high-end ones, to see what they think. Right. I want to see how you teach, and I want to see like what the things are. And so we booked that. We actually booked that first training call, and I delivered a teaching to them. And he was like, they all loved it. I'd love to invite you on the stage. I've spoken on their stage like 6 or 7 times now. Right. And so that's how you build a strategic relationship there, is you're looking at, how do I provide value to their audience? And the more like resources you have at your disposal, where either you've already prepared talks, or you've already prepared lead magnets, or you've already prepared books or other things that you can give to them that would be value to their audience, the more this is going to work for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Yeah.
So when you're talking to direct acquisition of clients, there's just a small change, right? And the small change is, instead of value to their audience, it's value to them, right? And so when the value to them, what you have generally done through the course of that interview is, you're looking for, where are you hearing their problems? Where are you hearing the things that they might be struggling with in their business? And where are the points that you have value that you can offer to them in exchange? So for Push Button Podcast and for the Hero Show, I have a whole selection of resources. All right, so I've got like I know for podcasts and for businesses, there's a lot of parts that go into having an offer in the marketplace, right? You have to have a sales vehicle, right? Maybe that's a webinar or a sales video. You have to know how to put together your flagship offer in the marketplace. You have to have email marketing stuff in place. There's just a whole thing that goes into like building all the pieces of your business before you get to, I'm going to build a podcast. And so what I'm looking for is, I'm looking for, when I'm talking to someone, where do they have holes in their business that would make it so that they're not quite ready to start a podcast? And so I have resources for all of those things. I've got training courses, I've got mind maps, I've got just everything that I've worked on over the course of my life, I've turned into little assets. And I've turned all of them into canned responses that have like links to PDFs, links to mind maps, links to training videos, links to all sorts of things. And what I'm looking for at the end of the show, it's like, hey, I noticed you were telling the story about XYZ. Do you potentially have an interest in learning how to do, like, I'll just give you an example, how to build a webinar, right? Because a webinar can really help you close sales. I have a whole webinar training that I could send you on that'll just help you get these things done. And when I send them that, it's got a mind map training document. It's got a mind map document that's like, that they can actually work in. And it's got like an hour-long training video. It's the kind of thing that like someone would generally pay $500 to $1,000 for the kind of information that's in there. And I just send it to them afterwards, after the podcast interview.
Yeah.
And so I have lots of different things like that, everything from how to develop content to a lot of the resources that we've talked about on this podcast, and lots of other things. And I have all of those saved as essentially canned responses. When we get off the interview, I will ask their permission to send them a valuable resource, right? And so depending on what I know about them, I'll put all that in my CRM, and I'll have it like, hey, I sent them this one, and I've got 2 or 3 other ones. And I'm looking at, how do I send just 2 or 3 pieces of like just overwhelming value. And so they'll get those
Yeah,
things.
I've been striding to work on building the Hormozy. Like, here's the free first step. So he talked about this recently. This is something newer, but he talks about like the next thing to solve is the next problem that occurs because you did the first thing. And so he kind of does a dual lead magnet thing where he gives you the here's how to solve the first thing and here's how to solve the second thing. And now you're sitting there like, now I've got the third thing. He's now prepared with an offer in the marketplace for the third thing.
And that's exactly what I'm talking about is like, so for me, I know someone's journey to getting a podcast,
Yeah.
right? I know what all the problems are that people have. And those are all things that I don't offer in the marketplace, right? I could offer all those as services or as products, but instead I have them as in my back pocket as resources that I can give to someone. And some of them are worth enough, like they're valuable enough that I could sell them and make them offers in the marketplace. But that's not what I want to do, right? I have this one offer and I want to scale this offer to wherever. So what you're looking at is if you've read Hormozy's book on creating good offers, you're looking at all the other problems that people have, solve all those things, build those lead magnets, build those resources. And that he talks about in that is like your lead magnets can't be crap, right? They have to be good, like the kind of stuff that when people get them, they're like, holy crap, like this is
No, I paid for something that was less good than this. Yeah.
yeah. And so like I have those resources and like everything is thought about on those, whereas like the videos, the stuff, like I even make sure that, like the graphic designers do a good job making, if it's just a PDF, it's beautiful and it looks good and it's got all the information they need on it to actually do something in their business with it. And so when I'm looking for that strategic value to a potential high value client, I am going to offer them some sort of value directly after the interview. And so now what they have seen from us is they have seen our initial outreach. Our initial outreach was good, offering them value. They get on our pre-interview call and we had that exchange and they know what our offer is and they have that pitch. And then we go through our interview and we exchange some stories. They know us, they know our values, they know how we think, they know about us, and I know their stories. So we know who they are and we understand who they are. And then when we give them value at the end, it proves that you were actually listening, that you actually cared, and that you had something already where you're like, hey, I know a thing that can help you, right? And here's a help for you. And all of this is cased in the idea that now they know what your offer is. And so when you follow up with them, be like, hey, how did that training on the webinar go? Is there any questions you have on that? Anything I can help you with that? Now they just sort of know who the type of person you are and the type of business that you run. And you can make soft asks for that. You can start making, I call it the bank of goodwill. And anytime that you do things that are valuable for them, and everything we've done at this point has been putting deposits in the bank of goodwill, then when you go to make an ask of them, right? Like, hey, would you like to work together? That's a withdrawal. You're not making the bank account negative, right? Because you've put so much into the bank of goodwill that when you make an ask, it doesn't even make a dent in in the amount of deposits that you've made.
In the balance. Yeah.
In the balance. And so you can, after you've done that on your follow-up, you can start asking the questions like, hey, I think you'd actually be a really good fit for a podcast. Here's why, right? And you can put those things in and now you can make a more hard pitch to them. And so if you're doing that strategically, right, have a CRM, have the resources in place, your podcast can turn business like clockwork on a regular basis. And so that is how you use the networking side. I know that's a long discussion, but does that make sense for how you can use your podcast to drive sales?
Yeah, no, it makes, this is going to be a dense episode to digest, and we're already coming up on that hour. So yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. I think this has been one of my favorite conversations we've had in a while, Richard.
Yeah. So
because all of it, yeah, each step. I mean, I know it's fairly high level when it comes to the interview and stuff, but like, I think you're right. The soft and hard call to action there are truly like, there is no real hard call to action anyways, because even the hardest call is after all that goodwill has been provided.
Yeah. And so when you get to that hard call to action, then you've built a lot of goodwill with this person. And so what I have found over the course of my year's experience doing this is that even when the answer is no, I don't want to do this in my business, it's always followed up with, but I know someone else who would be a good fit. How can I introduce them to you? Right. Or I have partners. And so like because you've just built so much goodwill with someone that they're like, I want to do good things for you. How can I help you? And so I get invited to stages.
Yeah, I want you to succeed even if I can't help you succeed today.
Even if I can help you succeed. And so they're looking for ways to do that because you're leading with value in the marketplace, which is what everyone tells you to do. And all we're doing here is just showing you how you can turn that leading with value into a strategic set of actions that you can take every single month on your podcast, right? And it'll just force you to do these things on a regular basis. So I know we were talking about two different types of calls to action, right? The ones for your networking, and then the other one is for your audience, right? So now your audience is seeing you do all of these things or seeing you have all these conversations. You want to also have the opportunity for your audience to become leads, right? And that's going to be a separate section. Those are the actual calls to action that you have on your podcast for your audience that they're listening to them. And that's where they're going to take longer to get to the point where they're going to convert, right? It's not going to be, I got off the interview with you and I sent you a thing, or they're going to listen to the podcast interview the first time and then just become a sale, right? They might listen to your show for, 6 months, right, before they become a thing, or they might not listen to it at all. They just are, they're scrolling through their newsfeed and they see you every day on your podcast thing. And they're like, oh, there's Richard talking about podcasts again. There's Richard talking about podcasts again. And they're just not in a place in their business where it makes sense until it starts to become interesting to them. And then they might listen to an episode or two. And then they might hear your call to action. They might hear a few of your stories and then eventually become sales. So it's the kind of thing that might be 6 months or 2 years down the line. But you always want to have,
the sales cycles.
Yeah. You always want to have your calls to action on your podcast. So when it does come the right time, that they know where they can go. And so on your podcast, there's 2 types of calls to action that we always recommend you have. And we talked about this in the content outlining section. So you've seen this before, and I just want to make sure you see where it fits here. And that's the soft call to action, the hard call to action. So the soft call to action is your on-platform action that you want your listeners to take, right? And that's the, hey, if you liked this episode, click the like button and the subscribe button, hit that notification bell, right? Whatever it is, the on-platform action.
Yep.
And so you want to make sure you have that in every single piece of content that you put out, is have that soft call to action that says, hey, if you liked this, hit the subscribe button, right? Because if they subscribe to it, they'll get more notifications. It'll show up in your feed more. And that's your goal, right? You want to show up in their feed all the time. You want to create that omnipresent. And so the more people that'll take that soft call to action, the better. And then the second part is your hard call to action. The hard call to action is an off-platform action, meaning you're going to have to leave YouTube. You're going to have to leave the podcast network to go
Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn.
Yeah, wherever you're at, they have to leave. And that's like, hey, if you really like this content, right, click the link in the first comment, right, and go watch the whole episode, right, if it's one of the short pieces of content. And right, that's an off-platform action. They're going to click the link and go and listen to the whole episode. If you're on the actual episode, it might be like, hey, if you liked this podcast, we actually have a document, right, a document that goes along with what we're talking about today, right? So like on the episode that we did about content outlining, we have the content outlining training document. You can go and download that, right? And so you have a hard call to action where someone can go get a valuable resource. And maybe it's a lead magnet, maybe it's a strategy call, maybe it's a free book. Who knows what it is? Might be, if you like this content, maybe go pick up our book on Amazon that we've got, right? It's $9, right? It might be a paid offer, but you have some sort of a hard call to action that you can tie people to. And so the way I like to think about those, your soft calls to action should be on everything. Your hard calls to action should be whenever they're relevant, right? So if I don't actually have a resource that I'm going to send someone to, I'm not going to just make up a hard call to action. But if I do have a resource, I'll make sure that we include it and that there's a link in the description for it that they can go and pick those things up. And so the goal there is that you just want to have those calls to action on every piece of content so that your audience has something they can do to move further into your sales cycle. That's a lot simpler than the networking side, but does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense to me. We should maybe do some content on the actual process of the hard call to action side later.
Yeah, like do an actual interview on it and go through the details on like, here's how you build hard calls to action. But yeah, I know this has been a very dense interview on how to drive revenue with your podcast. So I want to just do a quick recap of everything we've talked about so far. One, so the 2 types of podcasts, right? There's the media podcast where the podcast is the business. And there's the strategic influence podcast where the podcast supports an existing business, right? So we're building strategic influence podcasts. And with those strategic influence podcasts, 3 ways to drive sales, right? You have your ads, right? And those are the ads generally to self-sponsor your own show, right? It's like, hey, this show is put together because of our business. If you're interested in what we do, check us out over here. And those are going to be either in your intro, in your outro, or maybe an interstitial commercial where you drive someone to your business, like directly to a lead or a sales call or something like that. And then you have your direct sales, and that's where you have like your Dream 100 clients, your high value clients, and you're going to use your podcast interview to build that know, like, and trust before, during, and after the interview. And it's all about driving that value relationship. And the third way is with the networking, same kind of thing as with your high value clients. And the only real difference is going to be at the end of the interview, who are you providing the value to? And so if it's a strategic partner, you're looking at how do I provide value to their audience? If it's a high value client, you're looking at how do I provide value to them? And so as long as you're building those resources and have a good CRM to follow up with the people, you can use your podcast to really drive revenue in your business on a regular basis. And then the last part that we just talked about was the soft and hard call to actions that are for your audience who are listening to your podcast. You should always have soft calls to action, and whenever it's relevant, have the hard calls to action to drive people to it. And that's high level, all the different things that go into actually using your podcast to drive to an action. So thou shalt always drive to an action.
Always. to the action.
Always drive to an
Perfect.
action. Awesome. So, Kevin, thank you again so much for hopping on our podcast and having these conversations with me. I appreciate it, and I hope our audience appreciates it as well. And I think we're going to come back next time, and we're going to talk about, I believe, the 4Bs, which we mentioned a bit today, which is buy, borrow, build, and blitz. And we're going to talk about how you can generate leads in your business and how podcasting actually is beneficial to all 4 of those categories. So it should be a really interesting interview. And if you've ever read Alex Hormozi's $100 million lead flow, he's got 4 categories as well. His are great. I actually like mine better. I think the buy, borrow, build, blitz is more fun. So we'll have that discussion. And
I have somebody who does 4 C's in the marketing world. I can't remember what they are. Connect, communicate. I can find it. I used to know them off by heart. But
so when we get that interview together, maybe
all you marketers, you love your alliterative letters.
I do. I was at the Attention Awareness Authority, buy, borrow, build, blitz. Like, it's a mnemonics that help people remember things. And that's why we, like the 10 commandments, thou shalt drive to an action, thou shalt be consistent, thou shalt, have good, like that literary repetitiveness helps people remember things. And maybe at some point we can do a whole podcast interview on how you do that when you're creating content, because there's a method to that madness and it's useful to talk about. So anyways, again, thank you so much for coming on today. And if you're listening to this, make sure you like and subscribe to the content, and we will be back next week with more content in this series on the 10 Commandments of Podcasting. And if you have any particular questions that we haven't asked or answered yet, put them in the comments. We'll create content about it. So that's it.
Victory.
Thanks for joining us this week on pbp.fm. Make sure to visit our website, pbp.fm, where you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or via RSS so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a rating on Apple Podcasts. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. And if you'd like to get help building an omnipresent content marketing strategy with a podcast and you want help, you might want to book a podcast strategy session with us at pbp.fm. Just click the Book a Strategy Session button and book a time on our calendar. We look forward to speaking with you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.